There were hundreds of tapes stacked in brittle cardboard boxes, each labeled with a date and the name of a place that no longer existed. The static hissed like breathing when the recorder flickered on, catching moments between the living and the dead. A voice on the first tape whispered from somewhere just beyond the microphone, recounting a night when the town vanished after a storm that never touched the ground. The more the voice spoke, the more the air felt charged, as if the recording itself remembered. The person listening found themselves drawn closer to the speaker, unable to stop replaying the words. The voice changed slightly each time, adjusting to whoever was listening. On the fourth playback, it said something new, a phrase that wasn't there before, and the lights began to dim one by one, perfectly in sync with the tape's faltering rhythm. The tape's final words led to a house deep in the woods, a place where the air felt too still, as if waiting. The windows were boarded, yet light leaked through the cracks, like something trapped inside wanted out. The listener's car radio crackled even after the ignition died, catching the same whisper as on the recording. The forest seemed to lean inward with every step taken toward the porch, branches scraping against the siding in irregular intervals. It wasn't until the front door opened on its own that the realization came. The sound wasn't recorded anymore. It was live, waiting just beyond the threshold. Inside, the air was cold enough to crystallize breath. The furniture was sunken with moisture, wallpaper peeled like dried skin. A small recorder sat in the center of the room, red light blinking. When play was pressed, the voice described the exact moment. The same creaks of the floorboards, the same breath behind the listener's ear. There was no delay between sound and echo anymore. Every recorded moment became present, folding reality into itself like magnetic tape winding too tight. Somewhere between the words, the whisper said, "Now you're part of it." The floor above groaned as if something heavy moved in slow, deliberate circles. Dust fell from the ceiling in tiny spirals, and the walls began to pulse faintly with the rhythm of breath. The listener called out, but their own voice sounded distorted, delayed, returning seconds later from the recorder itself. The stairs creaked, but the sound came from the wrong direction. When they turned, the red light had gone out, replaced by a steady hum that filled the house like low thunder. In that vibration, they realized recordings were never about documenting. They were rehearsals. By the time they reached the upper floor, the sound of static was everywhere. In the walls, the floor, even their pulse. Each room was empty except one, where an old television glowed, despite being unplugged. On screen, the figure from the tape stood perfectly still, eyes fixed on the viewer, repeating words with growing clarity. "Play it again." The reflection in the glass didn't match the movements of the one watching. When the screen finally blinked to black, a faint red light reappeared downstairs. The recorder was playing on its own again. The girl, no older than 17, had come across the tape purely by accident. She wasn't the type to delve into family history or pick through old boxes, but that evening she was restless, looking for something. What she found was a yellowing box in her grandmother's attic, crammed between dusty trunks of forgotten mementos. The tape was wrapped in fraying burlap, with only one word scrawled on it: "Listen." She thought nothing of it until the clicking of the tape deck sparked something faintly familiar. The voice inside, now graining and frantic, seemed to call her name. As the voice grew more urgent, the air in the attic seemed to thicken. The temperature dropped sharply, her breath visible in the sudden chill. The voice on the tape was unmistakable now. It was her grandmother's, the woman who had died 2 months earlier. But it wasn't just a message, it was a command. The tape clicked off, but the silence was short-lived. From below, a thump sounded, unmistakable footsteps in the dark. She stood frozen, tape still clutched in her hands, when the voice from the recording spoke once more, clear and direct, as though coming from behind her. "Don't look back." The girl bolted from the attic, her feet barely touching the creaking stairs. But as she reached the landing, a strange humming sound filled the house, like an old radio tuning to static. She turned the corner to find her younger brother, no older than 13, standing in the hallway, staring blankly at the wall. The glow of his phone illuminated his face, but the screen was completely dark. The humming grew louder as he lifted his hand, slowly reaching toward the wall. Something in the corner of her mind screamed that he wasn't himself, that something had already begun to slip between the cracks. She grabbed her brother by the arm, jerking him back toward her, but his head lolled to one side, eyes wide but unseeing. The humming grew to a low, unbearable roar as they hurried down the hallway. At the staircase they were met by their mother, who stood at the bottom, her face pale and blank, as if the life had been drained from her. Her mouth moved, but no words came out, just an echoing hum. Then, from the corner of the room, a voice, distant, but somehow still so close, whispered their names. All three turned in unison to find the walls, now vibrating, ripples spreading across the old wallpaper. They had no choice but to return to the attic, the place where it had all started. The tape now seemed to hum with its own energy, its reel spinning faster and faster, as though it had a mind of its own. Their mother, still staring with wide, glassy eyes, clutched the stair railing, her feet dragging behind them. As they reached the attic, the door slammed shut. A whisper in the dark made the girl's hair stand on end. "They're coming." The sound of dragging footsteps echoed in the walls as the tape continued to play, each line now clearer, the voice more demanding, its presence now impossible to ignore. "Play it until it stops." When the girl's eyes snapped open, she didn't remember how long she had been unconscious. The world around her was no longer the attic, the house, or even her own reality. The air felt thin, distant, as if she were suspended in a place between places. Her brother, too, was there, though he didn't move. His body lay sprawled in front of her, eyes wide but unseeing, the hum in the air vibrating with a rhythm they both now shared. It was as if they were no longer human, but part of something larger, something patient. The static buzzed louder, an endless loop. The tape. It wasn't until the girl tried to stand that she realized they were trapped, not just physically, but spiritually. The floor beneath her feet seemed to dissolve and reassemble in jagged, unnatural angles. A voice, familiar yet wrong, echoed from the corners of the void. "This is where it begins. This is where it ends." Her grandmother's voice, but deeper now, layered with an unnatural force that twisted the words until they felt like a threat. The static in the air began to pulse rhythmically, like a heartbeat. But it wasn't their own. In the distance, the recorder appeared. The same one they had abandoned, sitting on a pedestal like an altar, its red light blinking as if waiting. She couldn't move. The pull of the tape was too strong. The sound of the humming grew into a frenzy, and she felt the edges of her mind starting to unravel. But in that chaos, a thought broke through. A desperate thought. The tape. She had to destroy it. She had to end it before they were swallowed entirely. But she couldn't reach it. The closer she got, the further it seemed to move, like the ground beneath her feet pulling her in every direction. The moment she reached for it, the world began to collapse inward. She felt the hum vibrating through her skull, through her very bones. It wasn't just static. It was alive. Her mind screamed to stop, to run, but she had no choice. The tape was the key. The hum intensified, merging with the sound of her own voice, until she realized it was already recording her. The air around her thickened, and she could feel the presence closing in, its hand just behind her, cold as death. The instant her fingers brushed against the recorder, the world shattered, the walls collapsed into blackness, the hum reaching a deafening crescendo. The girl felt herself torn from the physical world, pulled into the very essence of the recording. She could see flashes, fragments of time and place, distorted images, all looping, all repeating. Her grandmother's face twisted in a grotesque smile, her eyes wide with an unnatural knowing. "This is what you wanted. This is what you will become. The house had been abandoned for years. The once familiar walls now stood cracked and twisted, barely resembling the place the girl and her brother once knew. Their mother's face, still blank and lifeless, now hung in frames along the hallway, staring into nothingness. The static had consumed everything, but as time passed, the world beyond the walls began to forget, or perhaps choose to ignore the distortion. People moved on. The house became just another forgotten relic of time. Until one day the tape was found again. The new tenants moved in. A couple in their late 20s, hoping for a quiet life away from the city. They hadn't known the house's history, the dark legacy of the tape, or the whispers that lingered in its corners. They only knew that it was cheap. When they stumbled upon the attic, they found the same yellowed box, covered in dust, the same tape, wrapped in fraying burlap. The girl, now a woman, had long since been erased from the world's memory, but she hadn't fully vanished. Her voice had seeped into the walls. The tape waited patiently for the next listener. As they unwrapped the tape, they felt it, that cold, strange sensation that something was watching. The girl's voice crackled from the tape deck as soon as they pressed play. It was barely audible at first, but then it grew louder, sharper. The sound of static echoed in their minds, almost like a warning. The voice was distant, a faint echo of something ancient, something that shouldn't be heard. But it was too late. The moment the first words left the tape, the house seemed to shift. The walls groaned under the pressure of something unseen. And for a moment, everything felt wrong. The woman was the first to notice the change. At first it was subtle, a flicker in the corner of her eye, a shadow moving just a little too quickly. Then the humming began. Slow at first, like the soft hum of an old appliance. But soon it grew louder, consuming the house. The walls began to breathe. The floors creaked under phantom footsteps, and the shadows in the corners of the room began to shift with a mind of their own. They could hear it now, too. The voice of the girl, distorted by static, repeating one line over and over. "You're not alone." The man snapped out of his stupor, but when he turned to find his wife, she was no longer there. The attic was empty, save for the hum of the tape, now playing on its own. His feet felt heavy, as though the house itself were pulling him deeper into its grasp. The static buzzed around him, and he could hear her voice again, this time not from the tape, but from the shadows. "They're coming." The walls seemed to close in, and for the first time, he realized that the house was the static, that it had always been this way, and that the girl and her brother had never left. Years had passed since the couple vanished. The house, now abandoned for decades, had become a local legend, a place spoken of in hushed tones, a warning passed down through generations. The static had grown quieter over time, but it had not disappeared. The tape was still there, somewhere, waiting. And like an itch that could never quite be scratched, it had remained in the back of the community's mind. The cycle, it seemed, had never truly ended. It only paused. But now, it was about to begin again. A new family moved into the town. The Martins, a young couple in their late 30s, had recently come into some money and had decided to buy the old house. It was cheaper than most places, and they loved the idea of restoring. They had heard the stories, of course, but dismissed them as nothing more than local myths. Their son, Ethan, 10 years old, had begged them to buy the house, charmed by the idea of living in a place with such history. They didn't realize the gravity of the decision until they set foot inside. The moment they crossed the threshold, the static started again, faint at first, like an old TV trying to tune to a station. Ethan was the first to hear it, the faint buzzing coming from upstairs. He was always curious, exploring every corner of the house as if trying to learn its secrets. On the second night, while the Martins were settling in, Ethan ventured into the attic, drawn by the sound that felt as though it was calling his name. There he found the old box again, hidden beneath a pile of old furniture. The same burlap-wrapped tape stared up at him from within. Ethan didn't understand why. But when he found the tape, he felt an overwhelming compulsion to play it. He wasn't sure if it was curiosity or something else, something darker. But when the tape clicked on, the hum began to fill the room again. The voice, distorted and ancient, whispered to him, just as it had to the others before him, "You're not alone." The static filled the attic, and he heard the faint sound of footsteps. But they weren't his. They were closer now. They were coming for him. Downstairs, the Martins were starting to feel the effects of the house's curse. The hum grew louder with each passing day. More persistent, more invasive. The walls seemed to close in on them, and the house felt heavier, darker. The son's sudden silence troubled them, but when they found him in the attic, staring at the wall with an expression of pure terror, they knew they were no longer in control. The static was taking hold once more, just as it had with the others. Time passed, and the house remained abandoned, not out of neglect, but out of fear. The stories of the Martins' disappearance faded into local legend, until one day an outsider came, a man in his 40s, a journalist by trade, who had heard the rumors and was determined to uncover the truth. His name was Daniel Cartwright, and he had built a career debunking the supernatural, a skeptic in a world of ghosts and whispers. He was convinced there was an explanation for it all. But the moment he set foot on the property, he felt something shift, as if the house itself knew him. And it waited. Daniel spent hours inside the house, documenting the decay, snapping photos and trying to capture the silence that surrounded it. But as the hours wore on, he noticed something. A faint buzzing at the edges of his hearing. He tried to shake it off as his mind playing tricks, but the sound grew louder with each passing minute. The static in the walls seemed to vibrate, the same static he had read about in the local accounts, the one that had driven others mad. By the time night fell, Daniel knew there was no turning back. Something was inside the house with him, and it had been waiting for him. He found the tape in the attic, just as others had before him. It was wrapped in burlap, sitting in the same forgotten box, waiting for the next listener. But this time it wasn't curiosity that drove him to play it. It was the compulsion, the feeling that he had no choice. The moment he pressed play, the same voice began to whisper through the static, clear and chilling. "You're not alone." Daniel felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise, the air around him thickening as if something were about to break through. As the tape played, the walls of the house seemed to tremble, a low rumbling filling the air. Daniel couldn't stop listening. The voice grew louder, more desperate. "You're not alone." The room seemed to close in on him, the space warping, the floor beneath him pulsing with an otherworldly rhythm. Shadows twisted and stretched toward him, and the hum of the static reached a deafening pitch. He turned to leave, but the door to the attic slammed shut, trapping him inside. In the chaos, Daniel heard it, the sound of footsteps coming from behind him. Slow, deliberate, not his own. He turned quickly, but there was nothing there. The static was everywhere now, inside his head, in his thoughts. It was alive. He could hear the voices of everyone who had ever listened to the tape. The Martins, Ethan, the others, all of them, trapped in the same endless loop. And then, the most horrifying thought struck him. Was this his fate now too? Had the tape already claimed him, his voice soon to be lost in the static forever? It had been years since Daniel Cartwright's disappearance. The town had long since ceased to speak of the house, its dark history buried beneath layers of time and apathy. The world had moved on, but it had. The hum, that low, unnerving static, had never stopped. Somewhere in the deep corners of the world, a recording was still playing. And the tape, with its endless whisper, had not yet found its final listener. But someone would come again. New. Amelia Rivers, a college student in her early 20s, was the last person who would have believed in ghost stories. A self-declared skeptic, she had grown up hearing the legends of haunted houses and curses, but had always chalked them up to local superstition. A chance summer road trip led her to the town. Her friends, equally unbothered by the stories, dared her to visit the house. To them, it was nothing more than an old, abandoned building. But Amelia felt something different. Something inside the house called to her. Amelia's friends laughed as they ventured further inside, but Amelia hesitated at the threshold. There was an overwhelming sensation of being watched, as if something was waiting for her. The air thick with a strange humming energy. The faint static buzzed through the walls, growing louder as she stepped deeper into the house. And then, in the attic, she saw it. A small, weathered box, hidden under old blankets and furniture, just waiting to be discovered. She approached it without thinking, her hands trembling as she opened the burlap, revealing the tape. She didn't know why she reached for it. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the pull. The quiet invitation. As she touched the tape, a sudden chill ran down her spine. The static hummed louder, echoing through the house like a heartbeat, steady and unyielding. She pressed it into the old tape recorder, her heart racing. The instant she hit play, the voice crackled from the speakers. Clear, unmistakable. "You're not alone." The air thickened around her as the walls seemed to close in. Shadows stretched across the floor, bending unnaturally, and the space around her began to ripple, distorting into a twisted reflection of reality. The walls groaned. The floor trembled. The house was awakening. And Amelia, now fully aware of the curse she had unleashed, couldn't stop the inevitable. As the voice repeated its warning, she could feel the weight of history pressing down on her. The countless souls, lost to the hum, trapped in the static. Their voices mixed with the tapes, filling the air, the house, her mind. It was too late. Amelia's breath caught in her throat as the attic door slammed shut behind her, trapping her in the house. The air grew thicker, the static swallowing everything around her.